A good evening and very warm welcome to everyone. I'm Usama Khilji with another episode of DigiPod on DawnNews English. So today we're going to be talking about military partnerships with private technology companies. And in the age of technology, where we have all these technology companies that have expanded so much and hold so much data, billions of people are using technology every day, sharing their most intimate details with chatbots and uploading day-to-day activities online. How does all of this factor in when these companies go ahead and sign contracts with governments, including militaries? So to discuss this and a lot more, we're joined today by Steven Feldstein, who's a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace based in Washington, D.C. A very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on, Osama. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So to begin with, Stephen, you had a very good piece out in Foreign Policy last week, in which you talked about how Anthropic refused to, go ahead with their contract with Pentagon, and then OpenAI instead decided to go ahead with that contract. So just for the information of our viewers, if you could summarize what exactly, went down,
hmm
and your thoughts on it, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been kind of a slowly brewing situation for, I think, a couple months, actually. Part of it is that it relates to a set of larger issues, which is that we are at a moment right now where the products from AI startups that are potentially worth billions of dollars, certainly the contracts that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars, are just being incorporated into militaries and are starting to see the products used. So in the case right here, you actually have a company, Anthropic, with its LLM model, its AI model, Claude, that is already being used by classified networks, by the military and intelligence services in the U.S. And so part of the problem was that this contract initially was signed last year in July. It's a $200 million contract. And for now at least, Claude is by far and away considered to be the best when it comes to its use for the U.S. military. So what has happened that in the course of the last few months, as this contract has been deployed, there have been growing questions about differences and safeguards. In particular, there were two things that have risen up. One, should Claude be used in relation to looking at information collected from mass surveillance? And then two, or for the deployment of mass surveillance. And then two, should Claude be used for lethal autonomous weapons? And there actually wasn't as much daylight, I think, as people have made it out to be. But there was enough differences of opinion between who would get to call the shots at the end of the day. Anthropic, the company, in terms of whether the uses that the military was deploying were appropriate or not, or the military. And it became very wrapped up in a power struggle and a political argument, with the military essentially saying, look, we are the ones who always get to decide how technologies are used, not the contractor. And Anthropic saying this is a different situation. These tools are bringing an unprecedented ability to do things that could undermine democracy. So therefore, we think it's important that we have a firm agreement about what those safeguards will be. So they were going back and forth, and then it became a very public argument. And last week was really a surreal moment. On Friday, after continuing disagreement, although what I actually understand from reporting was that the two sides were very close. President Trump weighed in around 3:47 p.m. in the afternoon, essentially putting the pressure on and saying that no company will tell us how to run our military. And then, as they were getting close to a 5 p.m. deadline to reach terms, what ended up happening is, and this was just new reporting that came out, apparently there was a negotiation taking place between Anthropic's team and the undersecretary at the Pentagon, Emil Michael. They asked for Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, to come in right before 5 p.m. to try to hammer out the last few details. He was in a meeting, wasn't able to attend. Emil Michael said, well, forget it. The deal is, there's no deal. And that's when, at 5:01, a little later on, Pete Hegseth uh, basically said Anthropic is a supply chain risk. No company that is doing business with the Pentagon is allowed to also do business with Anthropic commercially or otherwise. And now things have completely blown up between the two. So we reached a point where there was almost a deal. A couple personalities in the room weren't able to kind of reach the finish line, and then the whole thing blew up politically. And now who knows where we are? In the meantime, in the next 24 hours, OpenAI had already been close to a deal. They're actually a real nemesis to Anthropic. Sam Altman and Dario Amodei do not get along. I think recently in India AI Summit, they even refused to hold hands together
Yeah.
for an announcement. Maybe you saw that live. And so Altman saw an opportunity to get close to what Amadei was asking for in terms of safeguards, swooped in, and now has become presumably the new AI model of choice in the future for the Pentagon. Although, at least when it comes to the Iran war, OpenAI's model is definitely not ready. In fact, Claude's model is still being used to guide strikes as of right now. So that just does show you a little bit the reality, moving a little bit from the political. But that's the fight. I mean, maybe that was a little long, but that gives you the details behind where things currently are at the moment.
No, thank you. That's very helpful context, because we see, all these companies signing these deals with governments, but it's important to know as users, what are we signing up for when we're giving our data to these companies? And how does that factor in these contracts with militaries around the world? So, for example, how has big tech become so central to modern warfare today? And what's the difference between traditional defense contractors and modern tech firms? So you described a bit of that on how there's this competition and companies vying for these contracts. But what's the role of data, software, and platforms in military decision making? For example, you mentioned the example of how this model is still used in the strikes in Iran. So how does that operationalize?
Yeah, no, a lot of great questions. Let's unpack those a little bit. Let's start with a little bit with the data question, because I think the data question is slightly different than the way people completely understand it. So my understanding is that the what you get from Anthropic is not that data that they have collected per se, because that data is actually information that can be collected um, publicly through, or I guess through private data brokers around the world who can sell bulk data to the Pentagon. So the question for mass surveillance became, to what extent would Claude be used to process this data? Right. So it's not necessarily that
Mm,
they would provide the data from their own users into the deal. That would violate their terms of service. The question was, would their algorithmic system, with the intelligence behind their model, then be used to discern insights from data that was collected in ways that ran against Anthropic's ethical principles, but actually didn't have anything to do with Anthropic's collection per se, but had to do with the Pentagon's collection. So I think that's one thing that's for this particular scenario is important. It's more about deployment of a model as opposed to data collection, and who was doing that. In terms of the question about big tech versus military contractors, it's a really interesting one. And I have a book coming out in the summer that looks at technology, geopolitics, and so forth. And one of the chapters really delves into the history of Silicon Valley. And what's interesting is that if you look at Silicon Valley and when it really started to emerge, it was in the post-World War II era, right at the beginning of the Cold War, where the government realized that relying on government labs to do all the research, and to come up with innovations and to stay on pace with the Soviet Union when it came to the nuclear arms race was not a great use of resources, that it would be better to tap into the universities and private labs and
mm,
so forth. And so you started seeing a partnership between the military and Silicon Valley, and that began in the 1950s, and that eventually spawned a whole series of startups, many of which got into hardware like microelectronics, and many of which ended up commercializing. But the history initially in Silicon Valley was one of military government cooperation. It was only later on, much later on, that you saw kind of a private breaking off and then an embrace of civilian consumer markets versus the military as a client. And then what happened was you sort of saw things go completely in the opposite direction. So by the 2000s, when you had the rise of big tech giants like Google and Meta, um, and so forth, they actually had very little connection to the military. and they were largely focused on building consumers as their profit generation. But a certain small subset of actors like Palantir still kept that line going. And then gradually over time, maybe it had to do with the kind of growing military industrial complex in relation to post 9/11. It had, maybe had to do with other factors. At any rate, we started seeing a growing interest by big tech companies like Google and others who initially had problems working with the military start to sort of reconsider. And then as we got into the early 2020s, that has become sort of this gold rush. They call it the defense tech boom. But you've seen, particularly as these AI models have emerged, a growing embrace by OpenAI, by Anthropic, by Google, by Meta, and so forth to partner with military contractors directly with the militaries, as we've seen here with Anthropic, and so forth. And so you've had a real shift. But ultimately, what I would say is that this, in some ways, harkens back to the very roots of how Silicon Valley started up.
Well, that's very interesting context because from what you're describing, this was essentially the tech project in Silicon Valley was to aid the military, and then what we saw was that some companies went into civilian use of technology and became all these social media and other companies, and now they're sort of like looping back to the military as we're seeing with the AI models, but also big tech companies like Google, Microsoft, and Meta. So just to understand surveillance as infrastructure, what role does the surveillance play? For example, a lot of people describe these companies as surveillance capitalism because so much data is being collected. How do you see the use of that data in military purposes or military uses? So how is our data being used? And I know you described how in Anthropic
Yeah.
case, that was the AI model. But overall, we're seeing a lot of reports of data being used.
Yeah. I think that the truth is I don't know, like if you look at sort of different partnerships that are taking place, I don't know, I can't tell you in terms of in the kind of interior of their operations, and to what extent is private data being used. One thing I would say is this, it's certainly an indirect way in the sense that if you are training a model like Gemini and you are by extension using data collected from Gmail accounts and Google searches and all sorts of other things that have helped to provide a rich source of material for Google to draw upon. And if that information then helps to train its models and makes it some of the frontier edge models, and by the way, is there consent being given by individuals for that? Unclear. Is there compensation being given for that information? Certainly not, right? And in fact, there are lawsuits right now, even in terms of books and other sorts of things being ripped off, magazine articles and so forth, that helps with the training.
Yeah.
So at least indirectly, these models are trained from user data, no compensation, very diffuse consent. And then these models are deployed for military uses. Now, how do models become so good? User data. And so that's certainly one way to think about it, that they would not be where they are. And this is true also for Chinese models as well, DeepSeek, Qwen, and so forth. This is not exclusive to US models. And frankly, what we're seeing in the China context is a similar kind of fusion or integration between largely civilian companies and a military orientation. But either way, you're seeing that without this data, these models wouldn't become powerful enough. And because they're powerful and they provide an advantage, that then is used, provides a military objective advantage, and that matters when it comes ultimately to final use. So that's sort of one way to think about it. Not the only way, but certainly one way.
And Steve, you've also written a book on digital repression, and you've looked at, the role of technology in democracies, but also in authoritarian contexts. And what we know is that a lot of these companies obviously operate as businesses, so they will have contracts with governments that are democracies, where safeguards exist and protections exist, and there's some semblance of accountability. But they're also exporting technology and selling technology to authoritarian states, where there's very little recourse to due process, or also very little opportunities for safeguards or protections to be there. In those cases, and keeping in mind, for example, the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights, how do you see the companies operating? Do they do their due diligence when they're making these contracts with governments that may be prone to abusing the data or the systems more? Or is it strictly what Pentagon's arguing, that, we're buying the technology, we decide how we use it?
Yeah. Well, I guess, it's interesting. I mean, I think it sort of depends on how the technology is being used, right? So in the Pentagon, you're looking at a contractual situation where they are buying a model and then deploying it in a classified setting. So it's a very specific contractual use. When I think about digital oppression and the kind of role of big tech, what I think about are countries, Turkey, India, and others that have specific takedown requests or propagate false information or propaganda that is used to suppress dissent, that is used to target individuals. I wrote a case study in my book about the Philippines and how Meta, Facebook, was used by the Duterte government in the Philippines to specifically target and harass opposition members, civil society, journalists like Maria Ressa, who I know you know and talk to quite often. And that was specifically part of his plan to undermine democracy and prosecute an illegal war, drug war, he called it, that led to 30,000 plus deaths of Filipino citizens. And so there are lots of different ways to think about interactions between authoritarian governments and big tech platforms. A large amount of it ends up being big tech that sort of allows their platforms to be misused, if not manipulated, by authoritarian governments to accomplish their political aims. And that's been extremely damaging across the board, specifically when it comes to elections and electoral manipulation. And we continue to see that kind of play out quite a bit. One thing I would also kind of mention is that there's also a sort of like an interesting flip side, because in certain contexts, I've been looking a lot at Russia recently, and Iran as well for obvious reasons. But in places like that, their choice has been to essentially dispense with big tech, to say that we want something so controllable that even though we oftentimes have leverage that we can use to get big tech to do some of the things we want to control everything. So in Russia, they've recently, I think, completely banned WhatsApp. They are at a point where they're going to break, I think, with Telegram too. That's very close. I think it's been throttled for a while. YouTube has been banned, Meta has been banned, and so forth. And what they're instead doing is pushing Russians to use a new super app called Max that is similar to China's WeChat. Because ultimately, the goal for a technologically sophisticated authoritarian state is to do what China is doing, create your own national internet, create your own domestic apps that are completely controlled by you so that you can do whatever you want on a surveillance basis, on a censorship basis, on a propaganda basis. So just another aspect to think about on this wider digital repression frame.
Absolutely. That's the pipe dream, right? Where you have access to all the data. And China does that quite well with their infrastructure and apps. Um, we started off talking about Anthropic and Pentagon, so that brings me to the notion of artificial intelligence and autonomous warfare. And of course, we're seeing the deployment of AI. So we've seen that Israel's mastered that, the US has been doing it, and honestly, all militaries are aspiring to acquire such technology. So if you could break down what qualifies as an autonomous weapon, and what are the risks of algorithmic targeting and escalation without human judgment? Of course, especially in terms of humanitarian principles. And you've spoken about China, so how that impacts the global arms race dynamics between the US, China, and other military powers.
Yeah, yeah, no, this is a really it's a big topic, and I'll do my best to try to break down a few aspects to it. So I mean, I think one thing I want to make clear is that we don't have fully autonomous weapons yet. That is something that
Hmm.
maybe in the next 3 to 5 years we'll begin to develop, but nowhere do we have fully autonomous weapons. And what do I mean by that? I mean a weapon that you can individually uh, order to search a target on its own without any connection to a human operator. To, essentially you can deploy a drone that's autonomous. It'll go into a theater. It'll coordinate with other drones, perhaps in a swarm. No humans are present whatsoever. They're not in the loop. They're not on the loop. They have nothing to do with that. They will seek out the target on their own independently and then and then destroy it. And the rivals will do the same thing. So essentially, you're looking at sort of like robot warfare to an nth degree. I mean, it's an appalling and it's a chilling way to think about things. And I fear we're not that far removed from that, but we're not there yet. The way the battlefield currently exists is, I think most people would say, it's a bit in a transition phase, so that you have technology that can do a few things. One thing it can do is you have sort of semi-autonomous um, um, devices, aircraft. So that means, for example, you can have a human operator that flies a drone, and you can also program via computer vision the particular target that the drone is looking for. And then, so this drone will sort of search around. It'll be in touch with the human operator. At some point, if it locks on or identifies the target, it'll then go back to the human operator for confirmation. And maybe sometimes there's not even confirmation if you're in the kind of last mile of theater. And then based on sort of hitting certain specs, it'll then swoop in for the kill. That's not autonomy, but that is something that is not fully human operated either. There's kind of a gray area. And when you see that a lot happening in the Ukraine war. So that's kind of one thing. The second aspect that we're seeing a lot of, which you refer to, is these AI decision support systems. And this has a lot to do, you see this in Ukraine quite a bit. You also see this in the Gaza war. And essentially what you have are systems that sort of are able to process and look through millions of bytes of information. And so, for example, in Israel, there's been kind of a mass surveillance that's been undertaken to access information regarding Palestinians residing in Gaza and the West Bank. That's fed into a system. The system then generates potential targets based on those phone calls, text messages, email messages, social media posts, and so forth that have been collected. It's able to sift through it at scale, efficiently, and swiftly. It then generates targets, and then those targets are acted upon for strikes. And what is new right now with these systems versus in the past is that never before has this amount of information been able to be collected so quickly to generate so many strike recommendations for targets, which is why both the amount of civilian collateral damage in Gaza and just the number of strikes carried out is at a order of magnitude 10x times what we've seen in the past. And so AI military targeting systems, and now they're being used in the Iran war, are essentially allow for this very quick cycle of the kill chain in terms of accessing information, processing it, generating the targets for those that the military is looking to kill, and then to then deploy munitions towards that. So that's a new thing. I mean, this is really, I would say, pre 2022, we hadn't seen anything like this, and because of the way technology and war have evolved, now this is becoming a standard part of how militaries, at least advanced militaries, are increasingly operating.
Please,
Yeah.
please tell us more about the US, China, and other powers race, and how AI factors into that. We saw, how DeepSeek came out and impacted the market, and there is clearly this competition. But what does that mean in terms of the global arms race, and how's these, AI models impacting that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, at the end of the day, the sort of biggest peer competitor that the US is concerned about is China from a military standpoint. And the biggest competitor that China is concerned about from a military standpoint is the United States. And, tensions are actually slightly lower now under Trump than they were in the past, probably because Trump is really keen to sign a trade deal with China in his visit to Beijing next month. And so for the moment, things seem to be quieter, but you never know where things will go. And structurally, the two countries are set up to be competitors um, uh, for the long term. And so for China, especially if you look at future technologies and you say, well, AI is going to be central to how we defend and how we attack, then it becomes incumbent to develop close links between Chinese
Mhm.
weapons systems and the products that their companies produce. And so we've seen reporting out that shows that China, just like the US is working with civilian companies for its military, China is doing the same thing. Is working with commercial labs, is contracting out with different entities, it is using DeepSeek and other models that are Chinese owned to help the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, develop new means of war fighting, perhaps towards a prospective conflict in the future with Taiwan. Who knows? But either way, if the future of war is linked to AI, then it is essential for large militaries to be able to harness and deploy these technologies. So we're seeing an AI fueled arms race in this regard. And it's a very scary thing to think about. Just as we saw and continue to see a nuclear arms race now, we've seen a real nuclear buildup in China vis-a-vis the United States. The AI arms race is a corollary to that as well. And it's pretty frightening if you care about, like I do, and many others, international peace and stability. We're seeing a real disruption to that. And no one knows where these technologies will go and what they will lead to in terms of future conflict.
Yeah, and Stephen, you described really well how data of users, phone call records, and other, personal data is being used, for example, by Israel to target Palestinians. And you've also talked about, how the U.S. Deal with Anthropic fell apart because of their concerns around mass surveillance of citizens. So that brings me to the last part of our conversation around accountability, ethics, and global governance. We're seeing how international law, is sort of breaking down. But who is accountable when AI systems make battlefield decisions, for example? And you said, a lot of this is semi-autonomous. But then there's gaps in international humanitarian law also that governs autonomous weapons, for example, or their role in warfare. And then we also have the issue of democratic oversight versus classified military procurement, where a lot of these deals happen without any oversight. So how do we deal with all of this, and can global regulation keep pace with technological warfare? I think that's really the big question.
Yeah. Look, I think you raise a really profound issue. And the short answer right now is it's not keeping pace, and it hasn't for a while. And the big actors who were responsible for building responsible norms in the past, when it came to the Geneva Conventions, when it came to other nuclear deals, the US, actors in Europe, the kind of the great powers, there is very little interest from their end to do so right now. So we're in a really difficult moment when it comes to international governance. We're in a very unfortunate, dismal moment where the U.S. in particular has so profoundly turned its back on public international law, on the use on the importance of accountability. I mean, across the board, whether it's looking at things like the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, or whether it means engagement in UN multilateral institutions, whether it means even paying credence to the laws of armed conflict when it comes to boat strikes in the Caribbean by the U.S. military. You see all sorts of things that are pointing in a different direction, where it says the most important thing to respect is power and might, but not international rules. Now, I don't. I want to say that if you look at the snapshot of the moment right now, it looks very bad. But in the past, what we've seen is that countries, when faced with sort of dire threats, technological or otherwise, start to rally together, and that publics that become really worried about this in democracies and other places can start to push their lawmakers to take this issue more seriously. So I don't think it's something where we simply have to sit back and say war is going in a horrific direction and we can do nothing. For one, I don't think, even in my own country, in the United States, that this is going to be a persistent condition. I think there is a growing number of people who are profoundly concerned about the violation of civil liberties at home and the violation of the laws of war overseas, and who will push for accountability. And let's be honest, I mean, as soon as the midterm elections in the US later this year, not to mention a new presidential election, we can have change. We can do something to try to reverse this. But at the moment, in this snapshot, when we look at the US and China kind of competing vigorously without constraint by rules, when we see Russia that is absolutely committing war crimes across the board, when we see the same sort of thing happening with regard to war crimes in Israel and the Gaza conflict, when we see the same type of patterns occurring in places like Sudan with regard to drones, it really is discouraging. And it shows you how much work there is to do just to enforce the rules that are in place, let alone to future-proof and create new rules that will constrain rapid technological developments. I fear that we've taken a backward step when it comes to accountability in the laws of war, and that we're not even holding ourselves to accountable today for things that we know are wrong, let alone setting ourselves up to have the right kind of rules to police the conduct of the future. That to me is the big problem I see.
Absolutely. And I think just to end this conversation, in your foreign policy piece, you spoke about how Anthropic is correct in being concerned about how its technology is being used. So, how do you see the future for other tech companies, and especially looking at this example? Do you think their behavior is going to change based on what Anthropic did, or will the impact of the retribution that they sort of got from the Pentagon make them more amenable to cooperate with governments, especially when it comes to military contracts?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I would answer that in a couple ways. I think first, in the very near term, we're not seeing tech companies stand with Anthropic. In fact, you saw kind of the selling out of Anthropic by OpenAI barely 24 hours later. So that doesn't send necessarily a good sign. And we also see how xAI's Grok is also kind of going in a very different direction when it comes to accountability than Anthropic. I'm not sure that we can expect very much from tech companies even on that level. And certainly the precedent that the Department of Defense is trying to set when it comes to saying we're the boss and tech companies don't have a say really does damage to that. My bigger argument would be that I'm not sure that putting stock in tech companies to be accountable actors to hold the line against governments will ever get you very far. As you and I both know, big tech has not exactly been an exemplar when it comes to upholding human rights and pushing back against a data extraction surveillance model. In fact, they've done the very opposite to propagate that, right? So to all of a sudden expect that big tech companies will go against their profit generating models and instead hold the public interest as the primary thing that they care about, to me, that's just not reality. But we do have recourse. We need other democratic actors to step in. If executives and presidencies are going to be unaccountable, it doesn't mean that legislatures and judges can't push back. In the United States, one of the things I called for in the piece is for the U.S. Congress to begin to weigh in, to begin to sort of establish and legislate stricter rules, to begin to at least uphold more vigorous oversight when it comes to how the Pentagon is using these tools, and to push companies to do better when it comes to upholding their ethical principles. That's how I think we'll get change. I think through pressure, through public outrage, and through the democratic process. But companies on themselves, I just think have little incentive on their own to not follow along what governments request of them if there's no pressure otherwise.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Stephen, for enlightening us with so much of what's going on in the world of AI and tech and militaries. And as you mentioned that this is a difficult time. In the short term, we're seeing companies being pressured by governments to give in. There are different incentives being given to companies to be more, willing to give up the data that they hold or to also compromise on international human rights law or humanitarian law standards that exist. But at the end of the day, this impacts everyday citizens. And we're also seeing that the public mood may be impacted by how these companies are operating, how much they offer themselves to accountability. And at the end of the day, we have to push for international standards to be, put in place to hold companies accountable, to hold governments accountable, because at the center of all of this is citizens who are impacted when their data is, used in ways that are not human rights friendly, but when also these models are used for kill machines and semi-autonomous weapons that are fast becoming, completely autonomous. So in such a time, I think it's important to call for accountability and for companies to think about human rights in their operations. So with this, I thank you for joining us, and we'll be back with another episode of DigiPod on Dawn News English next week. Thank you.